There are currents in a life that run deeper than you can perceive, silent rivers of intention that flow beneath the surface of the everyday. You drift along, thinking you are in control of your own small vessel, charting a course through familiar waters, only to realize one day that you have been carried, slowly and irrevocably, to a shore you never intended to find. For me, that shore was Julian, and the moment I realized I was no longer adrift was the night he fell asleep on my couch for the 7th time in 2 weeks, his hand dangling over the edge, fingers brushing the worn wood of my floorboards. It was a moment disguised as something ordinary, a simple tableau of exhaustion and quiet companionship, but I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones like a winter chill, that the architecture of my life was being fundamentally altered, one silent, sleeping night at a time. He was there, a solid shape in the dim blue light of the television I had muted hours ago. His breathing was a low, rhythmic tide, the only sound in the room apart from the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. I sat in the armchair opposite, a book open but unread on my lap, my focus entirely consumed by the cartography of his sleeping face. I knew the lines of it better than I knew any map. The strong set of his jaw, softened now in slumber, the faint scar that bisected his left eyebrow, a relic from a childhood cycling accident, the way his dark hair fell across his forehead, a comma punctuating the long sentence of his rest. I had spent years studying him from a safe distance, a quiet observer cataloging the details of a person I believed was firmly outside the boundaries of my own territory. But the boundaries had begun to dissolve. He was here, inside my home, inside my silence, and the line between his world and mine had become a porous, shimmering thing I could no longer define. It had started so simply, as most cataclysmic changes do, with a phone call and then a knock at my door. To understand the weight of that knock, you have to understand the foundation upon which our friendship was built. We met in university, two celestial bodies with wildly different orbits that somehow found themselves tethered by a shared, gravitational pull of circumstance. Julian was all light and motion, the kind of person who walked into a room and seemed to expand its dimensions, filling it with easy laughter and a restless, kinetic energy. He was a consultant even then, before he had the title, connecting people, solving problems, moving through social circles with a frictionless grace that I, a quiet photography student who found more comfort in the darkroom than in a crowded pub, could only watch with a kind of distant admiration. Our friendship shouldn't have worked. It was an anomaly, a strange equation that defied all logic. We were introduced by a mutual friend at a party I had been dragged to, a chaotic swirl of noise and bodies that had my nerves stretched taut. I was nursing a lukewarm drink in a corner, trying to make myself as small as possible, when Julian appeared beside me, a lighthouse grin cutting through the gloom. He didn't ask what I was studying or where I was from. Instead, he pointed to a terrible, mass-produced print of a forest scene on the wall. "If you could only save one color from that painting," he'd said, his voice a low conspiracy against the thumping music, "which one would it be?" The question was so absurd, so unexpectedly him, that it disarmed me completely. I remember looking from the painting to his face and thinking, not for the last time, that he saw the world through a different lens than anyone else I knew. "The green," I'd answered, without thinking. "The one that looks like moss after it rains," he had nodded, a serious, thoughtful expression on his face. "Good choice," he'd said. "That's the one with the most stories in it," and that was it. That was the beginning. Our friendship solidified in the quiet, interstitial moments of university life. In the library, where he would find me tucked away in a remote corral and slide into the opposite chair, not to talk, but just to share the silence while he wrestled with dense economic theory and I edited photos, the soft clicks of my mouse a counterpoint to the rustle of his papers. We'd walk home together under the sodium orange glow of the campus streetlights, our conversations meandering from the profound to the ridiculous, our footsteps falling into a comfortable, unspoken rhythm. He learned the landscape of my quiet, and I learned the language of his energy. I was the anchor, the calm port he returned to after his social voyages. He was the gust of wind that occasionally pulled me out of my safe harbor and showed me a wider world. My feelings for him were a slow developing photograph, An image that emerged so gradually in the chemical bath of our friendship that I barely noticed it happening until it was already there, fixed and permanent. It was in the way my stomach would tighten when he'd laugh, a full-bodied sound that seemed to vibrate in the air around him. It was in the casual way he would sling an arm around my shoulders, a gesture of easy affection that sent a jolt of warmth through my entire system, a warmth I would hold on to long after he had moved away. I kept these feelings locked away in a room deep inside myself, a room whose door was bolted and whose key was lost. They were my own private collection, moments and feelings I would take out and examine in solitude, like precious, fragile artifacts. To speak of them would be to risk shattering the very foundation of what we had, and our friendship was too vital, too necessary, to risk on the foolish gamble of a requited heart. He had girlfriends, a string of bright, lovely women who fit into his life in a way I never could. I was the constant, the best friend, the brother he never had. I accepted my role. I learned to live within its borders. After university, we moved into a 2-bedroom apartment together, a decision born more of financial pragmatism than anything else. It was a space that quickly became a physical manifestation of our dynamic. His side of the apartment was a controlled chaos of half-finished projects, books on market strategy stacked next to running shoes, a whiteboard covered in complex diagrams he called his brain maps. My side was a study in minimalism and order. My cameras were lined up on a dedicated shelf, my prints were filed neatly in archival boxes, my books were arranged by color. Yet, the spaces bled into each other. His stray coffee mug would appear on my clean countertop. My photography books would migrate to his bedside table. We built a life in that apartment, a domestic ecosystem that was uniquely ours. I learned to sleep through the sound of his early morning alarms for rowing practice. He learned not to open the door to my makeshift darkroom when the red light was on. I photographed him, of course, not in a studio, not with posed lighting, but in the quiet moments of our shared life. Julian at the kitchen table, brow furrowed in concentration as he worked on his laptop, the morning light catching the dust motes dancing around his head. Julian sprawled on the living room floor, exhausted after a long run, his chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm. Julian laughing with a friend on the phone, his head thrown back, his eyes crinkling at the corners. My camera became an extension of my gaze, a way for me to capture and hold the things I could not say, the affection I could not express. He was a beautiful subject, not just for his classic good looks, but for the life force that seemed to radiate from him, an energy that was both challenging and endlessly compelling to capture. He never minded. He would see me raise the camera and offer a fleeting, unself-conscious smile, already moving on to the next thought, the next task, unaware of the weight and meaning I was pouring into that single click of the shutter. Those photographs were my secret language, a silent conversation I was having with myself about him. They were proof of his existence in my life, but also a painful reminder of the distance that separated us, the distance between the observer and the observed. He had been with Amelia for 3 years. She was smart, funny, and ambitious, a perfect match for his energy. She was an architect, and I often thought of them as two master builders, constructing a shared future with blueprints I could never hope to read. They were good together. Their laughter filled our apartment on the weekends, a bright, cheerful sound that I learned to tolerate, even appreciate. I liked Amelia. I genuinely did. And because I cared for Julian, I wanted him to be happy. But her presence was a constant, low-grade ache, a physical manifestation of the door between his heart and mine. I was the friend who listened to him talk about their plans, who helped him pick out birthday presents for her, who saw the way his eyes lit up when she walked into a room. I played my part, and I played it well. The quiet, supportive friend. The brother. The anchor. And I told myself that it was enough. It had to be enough. Then came the shift. The catalyst. The event that sent a seismic shock through the carefully constructed world of Julian's life, and by extension, mine. It wasn't a loud, dramatic explosion. It was a quiet, devastating fracture. Amelia got a job offer in another country, a dream position she had been working towards for years. It was an incredible opportunity, the kind you couldn't turn down. For weeks, the apartment was thick with a tense, unspoken anxiety. They had long, whispered conversations behind their closed bedroom door. Julian grew quiet. his usual vibrant energy replaced by a frayed, nervous tension. He stopped going for his morning runs. He would stare at his laptop for hours, the screen blank, his thoughts clearly a million miles away. I watched from the periphery, a helpless bystander to a slow-motion collapse. I didn't ask questions. I just made sure there was always fresh coffee in the pot in the morning and that his favorite takeout was in the fridge when he got home from work. I offered my presence as a silent, unwavering constant in a life that was suddenly filled with terrifying variables. I was his anchor, and I could feel the storm raging above the surface, feel the rope that connected us straining against the pull of the tide. I just had to hold. The breakup, when it came, was clean and quiet and utterly heartbreaking. There was no shouting, no slamming doors. Just a profound, hollow sadness. Amelia moved out on a Saturday, packing her life into cardboard boxes with a quiet efficiency that was almost brutal to watch. Julian helped her, his movements stiff and mechanical, his face a pale, unreadable mask. When the last box was loaded into the van, they stood on the sidewalk for a long moment. I watched from the living room window. I couldn't hear what they said, but I saw her reach out and touch his cheek, a gesture of infinite tenderness and finality. Then she was gone. Julian walked back into the apartment and closed the door. The sound of the latch clicking into place was unnervingly loud in the sudden, cavernous silence. He walked past me without a word, went into his room, and closed his own door. The silence that followed was different. It wasn't the comfortable, companionable silence we had shared for years. It was a heavy, suffocating thing, filled with the ghosts of shed plans and a future that had just been erased. His room, which had always been a source of noise and energy, was now the epicenter of that silence. That night, I heard a sound from his room, a choked, broken noise that I had never heard him make before. It was the sound of a man trying and failing to hold himself together. My first instinct was to go to him, to knock on his door, to offer some kind of comfort. But I was frozen in place. What could I say? What comfort could I possibly offer that wouldn't feel like a lie, a betrayal of the secret I held in my own heart? To comfort him in his loss of her felt like a form of hypocrisy I couldn't stomach. So I did nothing. I sat on the couch in the dark, and I listened to the sound of my best friend breaking apart, and the silence from my own room was a different kind of betrayal. The next few days were a blur of hollow routines. Julian went to work, came home, and retreated to his room. We barely spoke. The apartment felt vast and empty, the air thin and hard to breathe. I would find traces of Amelia everywhere. A single earring under the couch cushion, a bottle of her favorite shampoo still in the shower, her name still on a piece of mail in the postbox. Each discovery was a small, sharp pang, a reminder of the life that had been lived here and the void she had left behind. A void that was swallowing Julian whole. Then, on the fourth night, the knock came. It was late, well past midnight. I was in my studio, which was really just a converted walk-in closet, trying to lose myself in the familiar, methodical process of developing film. The knock on the door was soft, hesitant. I opened it to find Julian standing there, looking smaller than I had ever seen him, his shoulders slumped, his eyes shadowed with exhaustion. He was wearing an old, faded university sweatshirt and holding a pillow. The sight of him, so vulnerable and undone, struck me with the force of a physical blow. "Can't sleep," he mumbled, his gaze fixed on a point somewhere over my shoulder. "The room's too quiet. Too big." I didn't know what to say. I just stepped aside, a silent invitation. He walked past me into the living room and stood there for a moment, looking at the couch as if it were a life raft. He didn't ask. He didn't need to. The question was there in the exhausted slump of his body, in the way he clutched the pillow to his chest like a shield. "It's fine," I said, my voice sounding rough to my own ears. "Sleep here if you want." He gave a small, grateful nod and collapsed onto the couch, pulling the Afghan my grandmother had made from the back of the cushions over himself. He was asleep in minutes, his exhaustion so profound it was like a physical weight pulling him under. I stood there in the doorway for a long time, watching him. The muted light from the street lamp outside cast long shadows across the room, and in that quiet, broken moment, a new dynamic was being forged between us. He had crossed a threshold, not just from his room into mine, but from his self-contained world of grief into my space, seeking something he couldn't find on his own. He was seeking sanctuary. And I, against all my better judgment, against every rule of self-preservation I had ever made, was giving it to him. That was the first night, the beginning of the ritual. The next night, he didn't even bother with the pretense of trying to sleep in his own room. He came home from work, ate the dinner I had left for him in silence, and then simply picked up the pillow from the couch where he'd left it and lay down. He didn't say anything, and neither did I. An unspoken agreement had been reached. This was the new normal. The couch was his bed now. My living room was his refuge. And so the ritual began to take shape, its unspoken rules and procedures solidifying with each passing night. He would come home, and the space would fill with his quiet, wounded presence. We would exist in a state of shared silence, the television on but the volume low, the air thick with everything we weren't saying. I would pretend to read or work on my laptop, but my awareness was a finely tuned instrument, calibrated entirely to him. I was conscious of every shift of his weight on the cushions, every sigh, every time he ran a hand through his hair in a gesture of weary frustration. And then, inevitably, his breathing would deepen, his body would relax into the cushions, and he would fall into an exhausted sleep. My apartment became a convalescent home for his broken heart, and I was its sole, vigilant attendant. In the beginning, it was a torment of proximity. To have him so close, so vulnerable, and yet so impossibly far away was a unique and exquisite form of torture. He was right there, a few feet from me, but he was lost in a country of grief to which I had no passport. My feelings for him, which I had kept so carefully contained, were now a constant, humming pressure beneath my skin. The urge to reach out, to smooth the hair from his forehead, to rest a hand on his shoulder, was a physical ache I had to consciously suppress. I had to maintain the border. I was his friend, his roommate, his safe harbor. To cross that line would be to take advantage of his pain, to turn his desperate need for comfort into something selfish. So I sat in my armchair, a silent guardian, and I kept my hands to myself. But the boundaries, as they always did with Julian, began to blur. About a week into the ritual, he woke up from a nightmare, gasping, his body rigid with tension. I was at the kitchen counter, making tea, and the sound made me drop the spoon with a clatter. I rushed to his side. He was sitting up, his face pale in the gloom, his eyes wide with a residual terror. "Hey," I said softly, crouching down in front of him. "You're okay. You're here. You're safe." He stared at me, his chest heaving, his gaze slowly coming back into focus. He looked at me, then around the familiar room, as if reorienting himself to reality. He didn't say what the dream was about. He just nodded, and then, without any warning, he leaned forward and rested his forehead against my shoulder. The contact was electric. I could feel the tremors running through his body, the dampness of his skin, the frantic beat of his heart against my own. I froze, every muscle in my body screaming. My mind was a chaotic storm of panic and a desperate, soaring hope. I slowly, tentatively, raised a hand and placed it on his back, rubbing small, soothing circles between his shoulder blades. He stayed like that for a long time, his breathing gradually slowing, his body relaxing against mine. It was the most intimate contact we had ever shared, an intimacy born of pure, unadulterated need on his part, and a terrified, tender caution on mine. When he finally pulled back, he wouldn't meet my eyes. "Sorry," he mumbled, scrubbing a hand over his face. "Don't be," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "It's okay." He lay back down, but things were different now. A new door had been opened, a door I had never thought to even approach. He had initiated a physical comfort that went beyond the casual touch of friendship. He had, in his moment of distress, reached for me, and I had not pulled away. The ritual evolved after that night. The invisible barrier between the couch and my armchair began to dissolve. Sometimes, I would be watching a movie late at night, and he would shift in his sleep, his foot brushing against my leg. The first time it happened, I flinched as if burned, my entire body going rigid. But he didn't move away. His foot remained there, a small point of contact that felt as significant as the joining of continents. After a while, I learned not to pull away. I learned to accept these small, accidental intimacies, to let them exist in the quiet space we had created without trying to name them. One night, it was particularly cold, and the old radiator in the living room was making a valiant, but ultimately futile effort to heat the space. I had a thick quilt I usually kept on my bed. I retrieved it, and, with a heart hammering against my ribs, I draped it over him as he slept on the couch. He stirred, his eyes fluttering open for a moment. He looked at the quilt, then at me. He didn't say thank you. He just shifted over, making a small space on the couch beside him, and lifted a corner of the quilt in a silent, sleepy invitation. My breath caught in my throat. This was it. This was a line. A clear, definitive line. My mind raced, a frantic calculus of risk and reward. To say no would be to rebuild a wall that had just started to crumble. To say yes. To say yes was to step into a new territory, a dangerous and uncharted land from which there might be no return. I said yes without saying a word. I sat down on the edge of the couch, my body stiff, my senses on high alert. He shifted again, turning onto his side to face away from me, and the space he had made was suddenly larger, more intentional. It was an offering. I hesitated for a moment longer, and then, slowly, I lowered myself down, lying on my back on the narrow strip of cushion, my shoulder just barely brushing against his. The warmth from his body radiated through the quilt, a comforting, terrifying heat. We lay there in silence, two bodies sharing a small, insufficient space, separated by a millimeter of fabric and a universe of unspoken things. I stared at the ceiling, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against the quiet beat of his breathing, and I thought, this is how it happens. Not with a declaration, but with a quiet surrender. That became the new ritual. Me, on the couch, beside him. Sometimes we would talk, our voices low murmurs in the dark, about his day, about my latest photography project, about anything and everything that wasn't the gaping wound of Amelia. But mostly, we were silent. He would fall asleep, and I would lie awake, listening to the sound of his breathing, feeling the rise and fall of his chest against my back. It was a state of suspended animation, a fragile bubble of intimacy that felt like it could pop at any moment. I was living on a knife's edge of hope and fear. Every night was a gift, and every morning I woke up alone on the couch, the indentation of his body on the cushion next to me already fading. I was terrified it had been the last. I began to feel like I was developing a photograph in reverse. The image of our friendship, so clear and well-defined for so long, was slowly fading, being replaced by a new image, one whose outlines were still blurry and uncertain. I was losing the friend I had, and I had no idea what, if anything, would emerge in his place. The anxiety was a constant companion, a low hum beneath the surface of my days. My work suffered. I would find myself staring at a print in the developing tray, the image of a stranger's face, but all I could see was the ghost of Julian's profile in the dim light of the living room. He started to get better, in small, almost imperceptible ways. The shadows under his eyes began to recede. He started going for his runs again in the morning. He even laughed once, a real, genuine laugh, at a stupid movie we were watching. Each sign of his recovery was a double-edged sword. I was happy for him, truly, desperately happy to see the light coming back into his eyes. But a selfish, terrified part of me knew that his healing meant the end of the ritual. When he no longer needed the sanctuary of my couch, of my presence, what would happen to us? Would we go back to the way things were, pretending these nights of shared warmth and silent intimacy never happened? The thought was unbearable. I had been given a glimpse of a world I had never allowed myself to want, and I didn't know how I could ever go back to living outside its walls. He started talking about Amelia, not in the broken, grief-stricken way he had at the beginning, but with a kind of sad, reflective distance. He talked about the good times, the things he would miss. He was processing, healing, moving through the necessary stages of loss. I listened, my role once again that of the supportive friend. But now, my silence felt different. It felt charged, dishonest. I was sitting beside him, our legs tangled together under a quilt, my body humming with a secret love for him, while he spoke of his love for another woman. The hypocrisy of it was a bitter taste in my mouth. "I don't know what I would have done without you," he said one night, his voice soft in the darkness. He had turned to face me, and I could just make out the sincere, earnest expression on his face. You saved me. Leo, the words were a spear through my heart. He saw me as his savior, his brother, his rock. He was grateful. He was not, in any way that he understood, in love. The hope that had been a fragile, growing thing inside me withered. I was just a port in his storm. And storms, by their very nature, eventually pass. Anyone would have done the same. I managed to say, the words feeling like ash in my mouth. No, he said, his voice firm. They wouldn't have. Only you. He held my gaze for a moment longer, and in his eyes, I saw a flicker of something I couldn't name. It was a deep, searching look, a look that seemed to go beyond friendship, beyond gratitude. It was a look of confusion, of dawning awareness. It was there for a second, and then it was gone, shuttered away behind his usual, friendly expression. But I had seen it, and it was enough to rekindle the dying embers of my hope into a small, dangerous flame. Maybe he didn't know it yet. Maybe the current that had carried him to my shore was still working on him, pulling him towards a truth he wasn't yet ready to see. The tension in the apartment grew, but it was a different kind of tension now. It wasn't the heavy weight of his grief. It was something else, something that sparked and crackled in the air between us. The accidental touches became less accidental. His hand would find mine on the couch, his fingers lacing through mine for a moment before pulling away. He would fall asleep with his head on my shoulder, his hair soft against my cheek. Each new transgression of the old boundaries was a question, a test. And I, caught in the grip of my own desperate yearning, never failed it. I never pulled away. I always let him stay. We were living in a liminal space, a house with no walls, a relationship with no name. We were more than friends, but less than lovers. We were two people clinging to each other in the dark, afraid to turn on the light for fear of what we might see. This strange, beautiful, terrifying dance we were doing couldn't last forever. Something had to break. The photograph had to either fully develop or be exposed to the light and ruined completely. The breaking point came on a Tuesday night. It was raining, a steady, relentless downpour that drummed against the window panes and sealed us into our own little world. Julian had been quiet all evening, a restless energy radiating from him that was different from his usual kinetic buzz. It was an anxious, coiled energy, the feeling of a wire pulled too tight. We were on the couch, in our usual configuration, a movie playing on the screen that neither of us was watching. The air was thick with unspoken words, so dense I felt like I could barely breathe. He shifted, turning to face me completely. The movement was so deliberate, so full of intent, that my heart began to hammer in my chest. He propped himself up on one elbow, his face close to mine. The blue light from the television flickered across his features, making them seem both familiar and strange. He just looked at me, his eyes searching my face as if he were trying to decipher a complex code. The silence stretched on, a taut, vibrating wire. "Leo," he finally said, his voice a low rasp. "Yeah." I breathed, my own voice barely audible. He hesitated, his gaze dropping to my mouth for a fraction of a second before returning to my eyes. The small movement sent a shockwave through my entire body. This was it, the moment of truth. "Can I ask you something stupid?" he whispered. I could only nod, my throat suddenly too tight to form words. He took a breath, a shaky, uncertain thing. "Would it be okay," he started, his voice cracking slightly. "Would it be okay if I kissed you?" The question hung in the air between us, a fragile, impossible thing. It was everything I had ever wanted and everything I had ever feared, all wrapped up in a single, whispered sentence. He was giving me a choice. He was giving me an out. I could have said no. I could have laughed it off, pretended it was a joke, and preserved the fragile peace of our friendship. I could have retreated to the safety of my role as the quiet observer. But I was so tired of observing. I was so tired of living in the gray spaces. "Yes," I whispered back. The relief that washed over his face was a physical thing, like a mask dropping away. He leaned in slowly, giving me every opportunity to change my mind, to pull away. I didn't. I met him halfway. The first touch of his lips to mine was impossibly soft, hesitant, a question in itself. It wasn't a kiss of passion or demand. It was a kiss of discovery, of quiet confession. It was gentle and searching and filled with all the uncertainty and fear and hope that had been building between us for months. I could feel the slight tremble in his hand as he raised it to cup my cheek, his thumb stroking softly against my skin. In that moment, the world outside the bubble of our couch ceased to exist. There was only the rain against the window, the soft sound of our breathing, and the unbelievable, miraculous pressure of his mouth on mine. The room I had kept locked inside myself for so long burst open, and all the feelings I had so carefully contained came flooding out, not in a torrent, but in a slow, warm tide of relief. It felt like coming home. It felt like a photograph finally, perfectly, developing in the dark. We had crossed the line, and the world on the other side was more beautiful and more terrifying than I could have ever imagined. The morning after was a study in silence and absence. I woke up alone. The couch was cold beside me, the quilt folded neatly at its foot. For a wild, hopeful moment, I thought he might be in the kitchen making coffee, that this would be the first morning of our new reality. But his bedroom door was ajar, and a quick glance inside showed me the unmade bed was empty. His running shoes were gone from their usual spot by the door. He had left before I woke up, slipping out of the apartment like a thief in the night, taking the warmth and the tentative magic of the previous evening with him. A cold dread began to seep into my bones, a familiar feeling of disappointment that I had taught myself long ago not to indulge. I tried to reason with it. He was probably just embarrassed, uncertain. This was new for him. He needed space to process. But the anxious, self-protective part of my brain, the part that had kept my heart guarded for so long, was screaming a different story. It was a story of regret, of a line crossed in a moment of weakness, of a friendship irrevocably broken. He didn't come home from work that evening. A text message arrived around 7, a sterile, impersonal little block of text on my screen. Hey, going for drinks with the team. Won't be back late. There was no warmth in it, none of his usual casual affection. It was the kind of text you send to a roommate you barely know. It was a wall, built of pixels and polite distance. The next day was the same. And the next. He was avoiding me. There was no other word for it. He would leave early, come home late, and go straight to his room. The door that had stood open for so many years of our friendship was now perpetually, pointedly, closed. The living room, which had become our shared sanctuary, was once again just a room, cold and empty. The couch seemed enormous, a desolate landscape. The silence in the apartment was no longer the heavy silence of grief or the charged silence of unspoken attraction. It was the thin, brittle silence of avoidance. I was oscillating between a deep, aching hurt and a simmering frustration. He had initiated it. He had asked the question. He had crossed the line. And now he was retreating, leaving me alone on the other side, stranded in the new world he had invited me into. It was cowardly, and it was cruel. The fragile hope that had bloomed in the space of that kiss was shriveling, turning into something ugly and painful. I felt like I had misinterpreted everything, that I had been a fool to believe that his need for comfort had transformed into something more. Maybe he was right. Maybe he was just a mess. Maybe it really hadn't meant anything. After 4 days of this agonizing limbo, I couldn't take it anymore. The uncertainty was eating me alive. I deserved more than this. The friendship we had built, the intimacy we had shared, deserved more than a silent, cowardly retreat. I needed to know, one way or the other. I needed him to look me in the eye and be honest. I waited for him. I sat in the darkened living room, the same armchair I had occupied for so many nights, and I waited. He came in just after 11, moving quietly, clearly hoping to slip past unnoticed. I turned on the lamp beside me. The sudden pool of light made him flinch, and he froze in the hallway, his hand still on the doorknob to his room, caught like a startled deer. "We need to talk," I said. My voice was calm, level. I was surprised at my own composure. Inside, my heart was a frantic bird beating against my ribs. He wouldn't look at me. His gaze was fixed on the floor. "Leo, I'm really tired," he said, his voice low. "I don't care," I replied, the words sharper than I intended. "You don't get to do this. You don't get to kiss me and then pretend I don't exist. You owe me more than that." He finally looked up, and the expression on his face was a miserable cocktail of guilt, confusion, and fear. He looked lost. He looked like the same man who had shown up at my door with a pillow clutched to his chest weeks ago. Only this time, the source of his pain was not a ghost from his past, but a living, breathing person standing right in front of him. He sighed, a sound of pure defeat, and let go of the doorknob. He walked into the living room, but didn't sit down. He stood by the window, his back to me, looking out at the city lights. "I don't know what to say," he said, his voice muffled by the glass. "Try the truth," I said, my patience wearing thin. "Why have you been avoiding me?" He was silent for a long moment. I could see the tension in his shoulders, the rigid line of his back. "Because I don't know why I did it," he finally said, the words a painful, quiet confession. "I don't know why I kissed you. I was a mess. I was lonely and sad, and you were there. And you've always been so good to me. It was a mistake. It didn't mean anything." Each word was a hammer blow, systematically dismantling the fragile structure of hope I had built. It didn't mean anything. The three most devastating words in the English language. All those nights, all that shared silence, all that gentle, escalating intimacy, reduced to a momentary lapse in judgment, a side effect of his grief. The hurt was so sharp, so intense, it felt like I couldn't breathe. But then, through the pain, a flicker of anger sparked to life. It wasn't just about me. It was about him. He was hiding, not just from me, but from himself. He was using his grief as a shield, a convenient excuse to avoid looking at something that scared him. I stood up and walked over to him, standing a few feet behind him. "You're a liar," I said, my voice low but steady. He whipped around, his eyes flashing with a defensive anger. "What did you say?" "You're a liar," I repeated, holding his gaze. "You can lie to yourself if you want to, Julian. You can tell yourself it was about Amelia, or about being lonely, or about whatever other excuse you can come up with to make it fit into the neat little box you've built for your life. But don't you dare lie to me. I was there. I was on that couch with you every single night. I know what it felt like. And it wasn't a mistake. It wasn't meaningless." I took a breath, the words I had kept locked away for years finally pushing their way to the surface. "I'm in love with you," I said. The words came out quietly, a simple statement of fact. It wasn't an accusation. It wasn't a plea. It was just the truth, laid bare between us in the quiet room. "I have been for a very long time. And maybe that's all this is. Maybe it's just me, and I've been projecting my own feelings onto every little thing you've done. But that kiss, that felt real. That felt like it was you, not just me. So if you're going to walk away, at least have the decency to do it without telling me I imagined it." The anger drained out of his face, replaced by a look of stunned, raw vulnerability. He stared at me, his mouth slightly agape, as if he had been struck. The air crackled with the weight of my confession. I had laid all my cards on the table. I had taken the ultimate risk. Now the choice was his. He just shook his head, a small, helpless gesture. "I can't," he whispered. "I can't do this." And then he turned, and he walked out of the room. He didn't go to his own bedroom. I heard the front door open, and then close with a soft, final click. And he was gone. I stood alone in the living room, the silence he left behind a roaring in my ears. The pain was immense, a vast, empty chasm opening up inside my chest. But underneath the pain, there was a strange, quiet sense of peace. I had told the truth. I had honored my own feelings. I had refused to let him diminish what had passed between us. Whatever happened next, whatever he chose to do, I had been honest. I had stopped being a quiet observer of my own life. I had finally spoken. The next 2 days were the longest of my life. The apartment was a tomb, every object a monument to his absence. His room remained empty, his bed unmade. He didn't answer my calls or my texts. I had no idea where he was. I cycled through every possible scenario. He was staying with a friend from work. He had gone to his parents' house. He had crashed on a teammate's couch. Part of me was sick with worry for him. The other, larger part was consumed with a profound, desolate sadness. I had risked everything, and I had lost. I had not only lost the potential for a future with him, but I had shattered the friendship that had been the central pillar of my life for a decade. I started to make plans. I looked at apartment listings online. I couldn't stay here, not with his ghost in every room. The thought of him coming back to collect his things, of us dividing up the furniture and the memories, was a fresh wave of agony. I was a photographer who had finally stepped into the frame, only to find the picture was a tragedy. On the third night of his absence, I was sitting on the floor of my studio, surrounded by years of my work, by thousands of captured moments. I picked up a print, one of the first I had ever taken of him. It was from our university days, a candid shot of him studying in the library, a rare moment of stillness, the afternoon sun lighting up his profile. His expression was so young, so open, so full of a future he thought he had all figured out. A wave of grief washed over me, for him, for me, for the two young men in that library who had no idea of the complicated, painful, beautiful road that lay ahead of them. That's when I heard the key in the lock. My heart stopped. I was frozen, every muscle tensed. The front door opened, and then closed. I heard footsteps, slow and hesitant, moving into the living room. I didn't move. I couldn't. I just sat there on the floor, my heart pounding, waiting for the inevitable, painful conversation about security deposits and moving vans. I heard him move around the living room for a few moments. Then, silence. After what felt like an eternity, he appeared in the doorway of my studio. He looked terrible. He was wearing the same clothes he'd had on when he left. They were rumpled and slept in. His face was pale, his eyes were red-rimmed and shadowed with an exhaustion that went deeper than just a lack of sleep. He looked like a man who had been to war with himself and had only just barely survived. He didn't say anything. He just looked at me, surrounded by the evidence of my life, by the proof of my long-standing, secret love for him that papered the walls. His gaze was full of a quiet, weary resignation. "I didn't know where else to go," he said, his voice rough with disuse. I still couldn't speak. I just watched him, my breath held tight in my chest. He took a step into the room, then another. He sank down to the floor, sitting opposite me, his back against the doorframe. He ran a hand over his face, a gesture I knew so well, a gesture of a man trying to gather his scattered thoughts. "I went to my parents' house," he said, his voice low, his eyes on the floor. "I drove all night. I didn't tell them why I was there. I just existed. I walked in the woods behind their house for hours. I tried to think. I tried to make sense of anything." He looked up at me then, and his eyes were raw with a terrifying honesty. "You were right," he said. "I was lying. To you. To myself. I've been lying to myself for a long time, I think. About a lot of things. When Amelia left, it wasn't just losing her. It was losing the future I had planned. The life I was supposed to have. It was easy, and it made sense, and I never questioned it. And when it was gone, I was completely lost. I had no map." He paused, taking a shaky breath. "And then there was you," he continued, his voice dropping to a whisper. "You were just there. You were this constant, quiet, solid thing in the middle of all the chaos. And coming home to you, sleeping on your couch, it was the only time I felt safe. The only time the noise in my head would stop. At first, I told myself it was just because you were my best friend. That it was just comfort." He shook his head, a small, self-deprecating smile touching his lips. "But it wasn't just comfort. It was more. It was need. I needed to be near you. And that scared the hell out of me. Because it didn't fit the map. It wasn't part of the plan. So I ignored it. I told myself it was just the grief. And then I kissed you. And for 1 second, for one perfect, terrifying second, everything made sense. It felt right. It felt like the place I was supposed to be all along." His voice broke, and he looked away, scrubbing at his eyes with the heel of his hand. And the second it was over, the panic set in. All the old maps, all the old rules, they all came rushing back. And I ran. Because I am a coward. I was so terrified of what it meant, of what I was feeling, that I tried to destroy it. I tried to hurt you, to push you away, because it was easier than facing the truth. He looked back at me, his eyes pleading. "The truth is," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I don't know who I am anymore. I don't know what I want. The life I thought I was building is gone. But the one thing I do know, the only thing that feels real in all of this, is you. Being here, with you. That's the only thing that makes sense." He finally stopped talking, the confession hanging in the small space between us. He looked utterly spent, stripped bare of all his usual confidence, all his easy charm. He was just Julian. Vulnerable and confused and honest. Finally, honest. I had imagined this conversation 1,000 times, in 1,000 different ways. But I had never imagined this. This raw, painful, beautiful honesty. I felt the last of my anger, the last of my hurt, dissolve away, replaced by a wave of overwhelming, heart-achingly profound love for the broken, beautiful man sitting in front of me. I finally found my voice. "So what now?" I asked, the words soft. He looked at me, a flicker of hope in his tired eyes. "I don't know," he said. "I don't have a plan. I don't have any answers. All I know is that I don't want to run anymore. I want to stay. If you'll let me." He said he didn't know why he kept coming back. Then he sat down like he finally did. I didn't answer him with words. I just pushed aside the stack of photo prints between us, crawled across the small space, and wrapped my arms around him. He collapsed against me, his body trembling, and buried his face in my shoulder. I held him, my hand stroking the back of his head, and I could feel the tension, the fear, the exhaustion of the last few days, of the last few months, finally begin to drain out of him. We stayed like that for a long time, two broken pieces fitting together, finding a new kind of wholeness in the wreckage. That night, for the first time, he slept in my bed, not on the couch. There was no pretext, no ritual, no unspoken agreement. It was a choice. We lay facing each other in the dark, the space between us no longer a chasm of uncertainty, but a quiet field of new possibility. He reached out and took my hand, his fingers lacing through mine, a simple, solid anchor in the dark. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I know," I whispered back. "Me too." He didn't kiss me. And I was glad. It wasn't what we needed. What we needed was this. The quiet, the closeness, the simple, profound comfort of a shared presence without the weight of expectation. For the first time in months, I felt my own anxiety begin to recede, replaced by a quiet, steady calm. He was here. He had come back. He had chosen to stay. The days that followed were a process of gentle rediscovery. We were learning a new language, a new way of being with each other. The old roles of observer and initiator, of anchor and ship, began to dissolve, replaced by a simple, quiet partnership. There were no grand romantic gestures. Instead, our love story was written in the small, domestic details. In the way he started making the coffee in the morning, remembering just how I liked it. In the way I would come home to find he had framed one of my photographs, a simple landscape, not one of him, and hung it on the living room wall. We talked. We talked for hours, for days. We unpacked years of unspoken feelings, of misunderstood gestures, of friendship and love and the blurry line in between. He talked about his fear, his confusion about his own identity, the pressure he had always felt to follow a certain path. I talked about my loneliness, my years of quiet observation, my fear of risking the most important relationship in my life. It was messy, and it was difficult, but it was honest. We were two cartographers, drawing a new map together, one conversation, one shared meal, one quiet night at a time. The couch went unused. His pillow found a permanent home on my bed. His bedroom slowly became a guest room, then an office, its door now always open. The apartment, which had once felt so vast and empty, now felt perfectly, comfortably full. Our separate spaces had finally, completely, merged. One Saturday morning, I woke up to the smell of coffee and the sound of quiet movement in the kitchen. I found him standing by the window, a mug in his hand, looking out at the morning light. I came up behind him and wrapped my arms around his waist, resting my chin on his shoulder. He leaned back into me, a comfortable, easy weight. We stood there for a long moment, watching the city wake up, our breathing falling into the same familiar rhythm. There was no tension, no anxiety, just a deep, abiding sense of peace. The current had carried us here, to this quiet, sunlit kitchen, to this simple, profound moment of togetherness. It was a shore I had never expected to find, a home I had never dared to dream of. And as I held him, I realized that some of the most beautiful places are the ones you arrive at without a map, guided only by the silent, invisible pull of a heart that knows, long before you do, exactly where it belongs. We began to heal in the beautiful, honest silence we had learned to create together.